You made it through week 2. Congratulations. Let's focus on some of the important things we learned this week. Distribution and finance are tightly connected because a solid finance plan is based on distribution projections and pre-sales.
When we talk about distribution and sales, we talk about the difference between theatrical distribution versus international sales. There is the version where the studio finances, produces, and distributes a movie, pays for the print and advertising campaign to make people aware of the movie, and then deducts the print and advertising cost from the box office revenues. The studios distribute their films through theater chain owners, the exhibitors, and make money based on the box office split that they agreed with this exhibitor. And that is their revenue, of which they then use to deduct the P&A cost from and any other distribution cost. A distributor can also be, in addition to a major studio or a studio, a streaming platform, a network station, or any other direct distributor, someone who takes the content and directly releases it on whatever platform they control. So they are basically the entity that releases your content. The difference to that is the sales agent. The sales agent is often named as someone to distribute the rights of a movie or a television series. But they're not really distributing these rights. They are selling it to distributors. So what they do, they basically can be seen as the middleman between the content owner, the producer, and the distributor, which is also the buyer. So they would go ahead and take a movie or a television series and sell it to a studio, let's say, in England, in France, in the United States, in Germany, in Spain, or to a television network in England, in Germany, in Spain, or the United States, whoever the buyer is, or to a network station that's also a streaming service like a Netflix or an Amazon. So the sales agent really is the middleman who sells the rights to the buyer in the various territories, which are the countries, and receives a sales fee for that. The domestic rights, meaning United States theatrical rights or other United States rights, are usually sold not by a sales agent but by a talent agency. Someone like CAA, ICM, UTA, you name them, all the big agencies that are mainly known for really dealing with actors and directors and have talent, they actually also do broker and have the position of a sales agent in that sense for theatrical rights in the US or for US rights. The advantage of using an agency like that is that your sales cost, the sales agency fee, is usually a little lower. It could be anywhere from 5 to 10%, let's say, with an agency, versus a sales agent who usually charges anywhere from 10 to 25% to sell such rights. Obviously, it's always dependent on negotiations and how bad they really want a project, but there are a few differences, and there are also a few pluses and minuses. Agencies do sometimes have stronger relationships with domestic buyers. When I say domestic, I always mean the United States. So therefore, it makes sense to have a talent agency deal with the US rights. The sales agent is usually used to sell all the other rights, meaning the international rights. International is everything and includes all the countries outside of the United States. We will look into the financing components for films, but I'd like to first look at the television financing components. What is television today? I mean, it changed so much. It all started with television channels who had commercials and were basically making their revenues from advertising sales, from commercials being shown on the network and advertisers paying for those commercials being shown. with all the various new network stations, the cable networks, the premium channels, all the OTT platforms, the streaming services, the smart TVs, all the various platforms one can enjoy television programming on, the revenue models have changed. What used to be advertising revenue, or still is for some or a lot of the network stations, is also changed to subscription channels. So we see the subscription channels like the HBO, Starz, Cinemax, all these channels that do not have advertising. They are funded by subscriptions, viewers who pay to watch that network station or watch the program on that network. The way they create program, obviously they buy program from sales agents, from independent producers, from studios, from anyone who has content available to sell. They buy it from there and then they air it. But they also develop content in-house. While the content development in-house was done more so based on the fact that network stations had advertising revenue, and while it has decreased, which means today it's harder to sell a network series or a network program to a network station because the advertising revenues have decreased based on the increase of the various platforms and advertising having to spread their advertising dollars everywhere. While this is all happening, network stations still need product. So what they're doing, they are looking for product that they can either acquire, which is a little less expensive for them than producing it and developing it in-house, or they're looking for product that they can develop in-house and produce in-house that is not so expensive. This is the reason why budgets today have to be really created in a feasible manner in order for anything to be sellable to a network station. As a producer, we have a few options, or as a content creator, I should say. We can develop an idea, which is usually done as a Bible, together with a pilot script, and we can go to network stations, platforms, streaming services, etc., and pitch the idea. And of course, we need to attach a meaningful showrunner, which will kind of dictate to the network what level of show they're buying and what level of show they would be developing. And we can then, so to speak, sell this idea to the network or streaming service, in which case they similarly operate like a studio and finance everything, pay a producer fee to the content owner, and they may or may not give a profit participation. But in the end of the day, in this scenario, they will control all the rights of this idea. So this kind of acquisition is similarly treated like a major studio acquisition would do when they buy a movie idea. The other option for the television project content provider, which, long story short, is a producer, is that they do something like a split rights deal. So they basically say to the network, I'll give you my idea, but I will only give you certain rights. For example, I'll give you the rights for the United States. So you can air my television show in the United States and you will pay me, let's say, 50% of the budget for me to give you those rights. That means I, as the producer, have to find the other 50% somewhere to then have 100% of funding available. The advantage of this kind of deal is that I also control the foreign rights, meaning the rights I have not sold to the network stations, and I own those rights still. And that helps me to optimize my revenues as a producer and content owner. It also is very interesting for investors. The last possibility we'll talk about is the idea that as a content provider, I can go ahead and be my own network. And how do I do that? I can buy time on a network and become a mini network, which means I go to a network and say, I will buy an hour on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. I then become the owner of that time, and I can put on my show, and I can also sell my advertising in that time. So I become a mini network and I do what the network would do with that time. and I pay the network station for the time, of course, because I'm buying the time. I will also have to find the financing to put together my project, which is usually done through brands and investors. These are the various options I have when it relates to television financing and when it relates to financing a television project. And of course, we will go into this more in future chapters. Let's take a look at what a basic finance plan actually looks like. And when we talk about a basic finance plan, it's a finance plan for a film or television project, including a television series, television movie, a reality show, could be anything, feature film, any genre. It's a finance plan for a film or television project that is not entirely financed by a studio or a network station, which means it is controlled by the content creator and content producer, meaning the producer. What elements would such a basic finance plan include? What elements are part of this finance plan? The main funding sources today include equity financing, gap financing, which is provided by a bank, mezzanine financing, which is usually provided by either a bank-like institution or an investor, distribution financing, which is provided by a distributor or buyer who is pre-buying certain licensing rights of and for this project, incentives, which are production incentives provided by certain countries in exchange of shooting my project in their location, could be a state in the United States, could be any country outside of the United States. This kind of financing is usually non-recoupable and is also referred to as soft monies. It's basically free money, and we'll obviously get into all these elements in detail as we go forward in our chapters. Furthermore, there are in-kind services, and they could be anything from a music investment, a post-production house giving you free services, any team member giving you free services, any kind of component that is part of your production process that you will not have to pay for. It's a service that you budgeted, but it's given to you for free. That's what an in-kind service is. The last component to our basic finance plan is brand sponsorships. This could be product integration, could be product placement. Those are two different things, and we'll get into the difference as we go on in further chapters. But they're also non-recoupable, which means they are free funding elements. It is very important to have a finance plan that includes free funding elements, meaning non-recoupable finance elements, because those are the elements that make any project, film or television, less risky. So again, as a producer, you have the option to ignore all these finance elements and just sell your project to a streaming service, a network, or a studio, give away all rights, and hopefully get a profit participation, and of course a producer fee. Or you have the option to independently structure your finance plan and keep those rights and work with those studios and buyers and streaming services as a partial funding component to your finance plan. When we look at the detailed funding sources and how much funding they would provide, we will find that, for example, a bank who would give you what is called gap financing, and of course they'll also finance distribution financing, but let's start with gap. They would look at your project and would finance a loan to you that would likely not be more than 20% of your budget. That's kind of the industry standard right now, and it's usually not more. When we look at mezzanine financing, which is basically a mix between equity financing and bank financing, they're kind of in the middle. That finance portion usually averages around 5 to 10%. When you look at your distribution financing, It's an interesting component, because what you're doing here is you're pre-selling your distribution rights, and will take those rights out of your future revenues because you already sold them. You should ideally try to sell 35% of your budget in distribution revenues. So 35% of your budget should be covered through sales you receive from buyers. The equity is the last piece of the puzzle as it relates to trying to keep it the lowest piece of the puzzle, but it is the first piece of the puzzle that you will have to find and put together, because the equity financing is needed for all different elements in the process of putting your movie or television project together, and we will go into that much in more detail when we go through the courses and why the equity is so important. But the equity is also the most risky finance component, so you do want to eliminate the risk of an equity investor by trying to keep the equity as low as possible. And I would say in the ideal world, your equity should not exceed 35% of your budget. That's ideal. Obviously, there are situations where the equity is higher, and we will walk through scenarios that show you how higher equity financing will reduce your profit as the producer. So it's not always advantageous to have a large equity component, because with a large equity component, you also lose ownership component in your project. And when we look at the value in the marketplace of your project, which is something that is established for you by a sales agent, you want to ideally reach 75% of your budget to be covered from international rights sales. Meaning, when you put your project together and your sales agent gives you what is called sales estimates or projections or ultimates, these are words used for this, that number should be at minimum 75% of your budget. If you have these elements leveled out on this kind of parameter, you know that you have a commercially viable project.
So on the previous slide, you got some ranges of what an ideal finance plan could include. You know, the ranges for the equity, the ranges for incentives, the ideal ranges for a gap loan, etc., etc. Now on this slide, I kind of summed it up on one slide that you can easily refer to. Now let's assume we have a budget. Obviously it's 100%, and now the idea is to cover this with financial elements that we have available. Now the first step is you talk to a sales agent and you are having him tell you what the international value is for your project. And in the ideal world, the sales agent would issue international sales estimates of 70 to 75% of your budget. Now remember, these are just projections. He hasn't sold anything yet, he hasn't done anything yet, he's basically just giving you the potential value of your movie. So let's say you produce a movie for $10 million, sales agent would come to you and say, I think I can make you $7.5 million from the sale of international distribution rights. So international distribution rights are rights that are being sold from the sales agent to a buyer, a local distributor, who would then take the movie and distribute it on the local theaters, local network stations, online, etc., etc. This is what local distributors do, and it happens in all the various countries, and the sales agent would be the one facilitating the sale to this country's distributor. Now, the next step is your pre-sales, your international pre-sales. Now, these are actual sales that the sales agent has done for you before you are producing the movie. So that means of the sales estimates that he has issued for you, that were projections prior, he's now made a few sales to some of these territories and some of these countries that he has projected for you. So now the ideal situation for you would be if the sales agent could sell about 30 to 35% of your budget at minimum in those pre-sales. What happens with those pre-sales, we'll get to later, but that would be the ideal situation at this point. In addition, you would figure out a way to shoot your movie or TV project in a region where you get incentives. So you've heard about New Mexico and Georgia and all these places where you can go and shoot, and a percentage of what you spend there will be given to you, will be paid to you, will be awarded to you. This is something you want to do because that's basically free money. The money that you get from these incentivized regions is money you don't have to pay back. And the idea would be to find a region that can at least pay you 20% of your budget. The next situation would be you would like to always have some kind of a senior loan, some kind of a bank loan. The bank loan consists of two elements, and we'll get into that later. For now, we'll just look at the one element, that's the gap loan. The gap loan should be about 20% or less. It will likely not be more than 20%. It's usually around 20% or less. We'll get into what a senior loan is. Just keep in mind right now, it would be ideally something you want to get, and it should ideally cover up to 20% of your budget. And the balance to reach your 100% budget number is the equity. Now that equity should ideally not be more than 35% of the budget. This is to protect your investor, to make sure that there is a reality of them not only being paid back but also making money with their investment. And how that works we will get into future modules. For now, the only thing you remember is ideally the equity should not be more than 35% of your budget. So that's your finance plan in one overview. Now let's see what we do with that. So this week you're taking your first little simple finance plan for the movie Taken in London. So we have very simple elements that we're putting together, and we're diving, of course, much deeper into these various finance elements as we go further in modules. So in this case, you see you applied the various finance elements, including your gap financing, which is your bank loan against unsold rights, your pre-sale financing, which is your bank loan against pre-sales. We're going to use a little bit of production incentive and some equity. So in that case study that you're going through, you should have a net revenue of 187,000 at the end. So give it a try, see if you make it to the same answer, and if you don't, feel free to send me any questions.